On today's Moving the Chains, a very special guest, Jarrell, a recurring guest now. That's Ian Guerin from Prep Redzone South Carolina.
Yeah, one of the many guys and girls around the state doing the work covering these South Carolina football players across the state. He's built quite the network there at Prep Redzone. Love what they do over there, and it was great for us to be able to chat with him and kind of see what the state of the programs across the state are as we head into the playoff picture.
Certainly enjoyed getting his perspective on things. He's got a different view than us sometimes, but really enjoyed talking through him and talking with him about his thoughts on the 2025 season. But once again, Ian Guerin from Prep Redzone today on Moving the Chains.
Get ready for the ultimate South Carolina high school football experience with Moving the Chains. From previews to recaps, we've got you covered. Dive into our expert preview shows, predicting winners and sharing insights. Then join us post-game for the thrilling recaps, exclusive interviews, and highlights you won't find anywhere else. Plus, connect with fellow fans on our Friday night spaces on Twitter/X. No one covers South Carolina high school football like us. Join us at Moving Chains on all social media platforms and visit movingchains.com today.
Welcome in to Moving the Chains, brought to you by Founders Federal Credit Union. I'm Kevin Thomas alongside Jarrell Hendricks. Got a great show today, a very special guest here to talk some South Carolina high school football, and that's Ian Guerin from Prep Redzone. Ian, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, guys. I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. As always, really appreciate you taking some time with us. If this is you guys' first time tuning in, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter/X, Instagram, YouTube, and more at Moving Chains. MovingChains.com is our website and our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, and more. Ian is the director of Prep Redzone South Carolina and has been covering high school football in the state since 2009. Ian, we're kind of coming down to the end of the season now, just a couple weeks left before we hit the playoffs. And I think one thing that I wanted to bring up that you guys have been doing lately that's been really cool is kind of your power scores, where it's a different type of ranking, talking about some of the teams throughout the state. Can you give us some background on how that's come about and what you guys, I guess, utilize to get those rankings from?
Yeah, we've got an algorithm. It's slightly different than what the RPI that the South Carolina high school is contracting through Max Preps. And I've been open about this, is that, one of the issues that the RPI system had is that it's set by Max Preps, and Max Preps doesn't have people here in South Carolina. And that's not to say that we don't all use Max Preps. I mean, we've used them as a resource for, a decade and a half, and it's very good. The problem is that if there's an issue with their RPI, it's very hard for coaches to sit around and wait to get it fixed. That's not to say that we're challenging theirs. It's just that we wanted an algorithm that would give us data points that we could correct the snafus. Those snafus are not Max Prep snafus. They're not Prep Redzone snafus. They're just operator error. I mean, because of the sheer amount of data you're pumping into those things, if you want them to be accurate, you need somebody and you need some boots on the ground that can notice those inside the state. So our power score was something that was developed by our development team. The Prep Redzone company is actually a subsidiary of what's called the Prep Network. It's all based out of Minnesota. They've got, sports in, 4 or 5 different sports in a lot of states around the country. In South Carolina, we just do football, and then there's a prep hoop site as well. But that power score was something that was kind of developed over time. What are the most important factors going into determining what is known and what would become known as the RPI? And they tinkered with it a little bit. They worked with it last year behind the scenes. So while I could see it as the director of the site and working along with the development team, we were only running it kind of as a dummy last year. So we wanted to see how scores were entered. We wanted to see how accurate those were. We wanted to see who was accurately entering scores. And then we had to find out overnight. We have every overnight on a Friday into Saturday, we have what's called a VA team. And this is a large group of people from around the world that the Prep Network has hired just to track down scores. So let's say that me and the Prep Redzone South Carolina school, all of us scouts go out to games. Well, that's still only 7 games every week. There are 248 high school varsity football teams in the state of South Carolina, and that doesn't include 8-man, and that doesn't include all the independent teams, some of these charter school programs and things like that. It's just a ton of data. We wanted to say, okay, if we're putting all these boots on the ground, and we're going to keep letting Ian hire these guys, all of these old names that you guys have read about for years and years. Let's get our own system in place so that we can reap that data. We can use it for content pieces, but also what we've done is we've taken all of it out from behind the paywall. There's no mystery to it. There's no, I don't want to have to subscribe to Prep Red Zone to see that. We've taken the same model with that as we did with our stats pages. So just like Max Preps for years and years, I mean, I can tell you 100 different sports writers that have come through the state of South Carolina, since 2004 when I first got here, that have used Max Preps. Now you can do that with Prep Red Zone as well. Is it perfect? No. This is the first year we've unveiled this. We've got kinks galore, and we're the first people willing to admit that. But we want to see all that data. We want it on our website. We want it at our fingertips. We want to be able to drive content with it. But we also want to use it to develop trends. And so what we've already seen is with our power score and the difference from the RPI, the biggest thing that you're going to notice is that we are weighting teams based on their classification, which also means we're weighting their opponents based on their classification as well. So if you're a 5A team and you go out and let's say that you play 5 non-region games against teams from smaller classifications, and let's say that all those teams end up with a winning record, Max Preps' formula is going to give that team a bigger boost than ours is, because they don't weight classifications. They deem that to be not as important when they were using their large scale data. We said, you know what, we're doing this kind of on micro scale of state by state. We've got a better way of looking at it for the usage that we want on the back end. So why can't we weight those classifications? We've also weighted point differential a little differently than they have, so there's going to be some tinkers in there, from one site to the other. If you look at ours, we've got Irmo number 1, we've got Indian Land number 2, we've got Northwestern number 3. If you look at theirs, it's Irmo 1, Northwestern 2, Indian Land number 3. So after that, they've got it where if you're looking at classifications, which is the only purpose that you would look at it for Max Preps, you're able to say, okay, well, how would I break down 5A, 4A, 3A? Ours, what we've done is we've got it all grouped together. Okay, so you can split those classifications out. But if you want to say, okay, what does the Prep Red Zone power score say about a team like Loris? Well, you can go in there, you hit the power scores, it's automatically 5A through 1A and SCSA 4A through 1A. They're all grouped together. You can break them apart if you want, or if you need to, or if you just want to see how that algorithm works between classifications, it makes it a lot easier to do so. So, I think that's one of the benefits to ours. Again, we need time with it. We need to run this for probably another full season before it is what we would call perfected. Okay, 248 teams across the state, varsity teams, 11-man football. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of tinkering. It's a lot of making sure that data is being entered, the right way.
And I got to ask, based on that, what's the consumer feedback been for you since you've unveiled that this season? And I'm comparing apples to oranges in what we do. We do our own rankings outside of what the state produces through, the prep poll. And that's the biggest feedback that we probably get, on our social medias and in our shows on Tuesday. What's been the response so far for you guys with your power score?
Yeah, I mean, it's been positive in a lot of ways, and I'm not taking credit for this, but numbers are numbers, right? So you can interpret numbers any way you see fit. We see this every year where there's some grand debate about where a team lies. Maybe we're worried about team XYZ not being eligible for the playoffs. Well, what happens if that team can't compete? Or what do we do with this game that ended up in a quirky tie, like Carolina Forest and Hartsville did last year? What happens if a team is just destroying somebody, they pull out all their starters, and now all of a sudden the score is a 15-point game as opposed to a 28-point game? So all of those things factor in. So obviously, I think if you were to ask, Aaron Brand, he would say, man, I love that system. Well, of course, because we've got you at number 1. What do you, ask Adam Hastings at Indialand? I'd say he's probably pretty happy with it because we've got him at number 2. If you look at, you ask Greg Mance at Loris if he cared about such things, he'd say, man, that's awesome. I can't believe we have the same power score as Dutch Fork right now. Okay, again, what do we think happens if Dutch Fork plays Loris? I mean, I think the consensus is going to be pretty straightforward on what the answer is going to be. But again, it is comparing apples to oranges, kind of like you said. And so I think it's important to show people that it's not 5A or bust. We're in this new transfer market where kids can come and go. A lot of the times, as long as they do it before the first day of fall practice, no questions asked, so let's not build it up where if you're not at a 5A school, you don't matter. Let's not tell the 1A and 2A and 3A kids, you know what, we think you did a great job, but, and that's really nice that Oceanside beat Dutch Fork, but that was a September game and it doesn't really matter. It does matter because these guys go to this school. They have just as much pride as anybody at any other classification. So this gives us a way to kind of numerically value all 248 teams in the state. And for that reason, it is probably more than anything else. I really dig it.
We talked about the RPI a little bit here that Max Preps does. And for folks who don't know, like I said, the high school league uses that in 5A and 4A for some different seeding stuff, maybe for some at-large teams here and there. Do you think, is it I guess, do you like the process of utilizing that instead of the old way where it was just kind of bracketed out, region goes here, region goes here? And then do you think this is something that we see maybe trend down into 3A, 2A, 1A eventually? Or do you think they kind of keep that bracketed, preset bracket feel in those lower classes moving forward?
Anything's a possibility moving forward. And I think that, it's like all the people that are asking me about realignment, what I think is going to happen right now. Anybody who's telling you that they've got a good idea what's going to happen is lying to you, because until the realignment committee sets how many teams are in each classification, it doesn't matter. All the rest of it is smoke and mirrors. And, this team lost kids. Well, this school lost enrollment. It does not matter, because we don't know until they set that 5A number what the rest of the classifications are going to look like. So, when you start looking at, RPI and its, its impact on the smaller classifications, I think that's kind of going back to what I said, is you want to get as clear of a picture as you possibly can without, necessarily saying, oh, we're only going to run the RPI for 5A and 4A because those are the only classifications that look at it. But even look at this year and what they did in 4A. A lot of people haven't noticed this yet, but in 4A, they are going to an open RPI system after they determine in the lower state playoffs, after they determine the number 1 and number 2 seeds. And the reason they did that is because they were finding that on the number 3 seeds, you might have a team that is considerably better that finished 4th in their region, but because they're playing in a stronger region, maybe because they, and they got bumped down, let's not penalize those types of teams. And so when we see the 4A bracket set next week, that's going to be the biggest change even from last year. And we're smack dab in the middle of year 2 of a realignment cycle. So, for them to make those kind of changes tells me that they're paying attention and they're listening to more of the gripes or complaints or, things that we need to just alter even a little bit, because, if you're looking at 3 regions in the lower state 4A classification from year to year, they could look dramatically different based on, you go from, South Florence and Hartsville's region to Hilton Head and Bluffton, Beaufort, Bishop England, there's no telling. But if we can tinker that and keep tinkering that year to year on a playoff spectrum, then I think we get something that looks a little bit more realistic year to year.
I'm glad you brought up realignment. That's obviously one of the hot topics. As we're still in the season, but we'll be in the off season before now, and you're at the end of that 2-year cycle. The greatest speculation right now is that 5A is going to be combined once again next year. We don't know that. We'll see what happens in a few months. But what is your opinion on that? I would like to see it brought back together, but what are you thinking so far? And how does that trickle down to the other classes if they do recombine 5A?
No, and I think you answered your own question, Gerald, because I don't think you can combine 5A as long as 5A is so much bigger than 4A and 3A. And I think that was the issue with, you're always going to have this enrollment disparity, even just within the 5A teams. I mean, I live here in Horry County, not far from St. James and Socastee high schools. And, I have a hard time telling kids that are trying to go to school there or whatever else that they've got a chance at a state championship if 5A is all in one. These are teams that year in and year out can't even compete with Carolina Forest. Carolina Forest last year lost they lost to James Island very early in the playoffs. And so you're telling me that they're the pride of that region, but even Carolina Forest in a school that, they're either second or third in the state in enrollment right now. They've got one of the most respected football coaches in the entire state. And you're telling me that these guys can't compete with them. And then that, Carolina Forest can't compete with the rest of 5A Division I. Putting it all back together is a tough sell as long as you're going to leave 5A as big as it is. And just my personal opinion, this isn't inside information, but if you're not going to split the classifications that are the biggest among them, then you got to find some other way to keep it equitable. Does that mean bumping some of those teams back down to 4A? Does it mean breaking up some regions like the recently formed Beach region that used to all be together in 3A and then moved up to 4A, and then Carolina Forest split off? How do you deal with the Florence area schools? But then what do you do with schools like Sumter? Or what do you do with the north end of Charleston? Do you have to combine Horry County and Charleston when Carolina Forest is a 2-hour and 20-minute drive to Stratford High School? Okay, if you're only looking at it in football terms, it's a different conversation. The problem is that we're never looking at it in just football terms, and you can't do that because what you're going to end up with is that's going to keep filtering down, and then you're going to end up with cash-strapped 2A and 1A programs that have to send every track team, softball, baseball, girls and boys basketball, wrestling for 2 hours and 20 minutes each way for a regular region match, which are not always played on Friday night. They're played during the week. You're taking too much away. The North Carolina system, I've never been a very big fan of it because it's been too hard to understand. And even somebody like me who has been responsible for tracking kids in North Carolina and, working with, our cohorts from, Prep Redzone North Carolina, at times it can get very confusing. The one thing that I do like about it, though, is that it says that we can merge regions and then break them apart for playoff purposes. They're using the same RPI system that South Carolina is to set some of those playoffs. There's got to be some kind of healthy medium here, because it's clear that, the way that some of the school consolidation is going in some of the rural areas around the state versus some of the expansion and the big metroplexes, we're going to keep running into these issues more and more, where the non-football sports are just going to keep getting hammered. And it's not fair to them, because whether a kid plays multiple sports or whether the kid never wants to put on football pads and just go play 3 other things, they shouldn't have to make that choice, based on how much school time am I going to miss? Am I going to have time to do my homework? Am I going to be forced to do my homework on a bus? These are things that often get lost in the shuffle because we are a football-centric state. And look, I run a football-only site, so I get it, but you can't lose track of that, because once you do, you start affecting, schools and communities, and it can put way too much stress. And the last thing we want is schools to start having to make the choice that McBee did last week. They're already low in numbers. Yeah. They don't want to travel across the state with 15, 16 varsity kids and go get thumped, and so they made the decision just to forfeit a week 9 game, or a week 8 game. I mean, it's just, we don't want to see that. We don't want to take kids off the courts, off the fields, off the tracks. We want them participating. You have to have that. And the second you don't, and you start encouraging them to make a choice based on long bus trips and everything else, that's sacrificing what they're really in school to do, then we're going to have bigger problems.
One change we did see this year, Ian, is the logistics of the state championship weekend. The last couple of years we've had a Thursday, Friday, Saturday kind of mix. Now we're going all to just 2 days. And I know a lot of fans, a lot of coaches, I think it somewhat kind of lobbied for that to kind of get it a little bit more condensed there. Mm-hmm. Is that something where you think that the high school league, listened to some people on the outside and said, hey, listen, this is what people want? Or is it more of a monetary issue there? And just what do you think led to that? And also, do you like it going back to just a 2-day situation there?
I think it's all of the above. I've run enough events in my years to know that consolidation means less downtime, which means you're paying fewer people to stand around in between games. I mean, there have been a lot of state championships that I've gone to with very empty stadiums, and that can help combat that a little bit, because maybe people want to stick around to see the 4A game, even if they're 2A fans or whatever it is. So I think that can be beneficial. I think you're talking about travel, you're talking about, potential hotel stays, you're talking about referee situations. Consolidation felt to me like it was an easy and at least right choice to go back to experimenting to, because it had been a while since we have done that. And so I think I think personally it'll be a good move. I want to see it in action, though. I want to see how the high school league officials handle that. I mean, very basic things like last year, we were having trouble getting stats delivered. If I wasn't sitting in the press box, it might be 4 or 5 hours. Well, not all of us have 4 or 5 hours to sit around and wait. We've got deadlines. There's TV reporters across the state that want to be able to show highlights to their communities. And they, if they got to sit around and wait for, some of the numbers to come in, or some, let's say you got a goofy play at the end and they got to review tape to make sure it was right and all that, just for statistical purposes. You don't want to have to do that. So I'm interested to see it. I think it'll go well. I hope it'll go well, because, the taking 3 days, to play games in Orangeburg, which isn't convenient for a lot of people to get to, it's the same thing. Like, if you spread out, the lower upper state basketball tournaments in Florence, I mean, sometimes you just jam them in and let the cards fall where they may. And, you beef up on security for a couple of days, you keep everybody safe. You get your system in place. You well mark all your entrances, your exits, your, concession stands, your bathrooms. You do all this, and then you just kind of let human beings, be human beings, and try not to stretch it out and say, oh, well, we got to clear the stadium and it's going to take 4 hours and then we'll open the doors back up. I mean, people don't want to wait. So.
Last kind of like state of the union question here in South Carolina. The high school league, obviously, this offseason revamped the transfer rules, and we talked about that briefly earlier in this interview. And we've seen the ramifications and the ripples across the state so far. What are your just short thoughts on that? That rule and how that's going. And I really want to ask you, as someone who tracks recruiting as well, how has that affected your network and trying to keep track of where these guys have ended up? Because me and Kevin were definitely scrambling those last few months before week 0.
You ever just had a shoe that you were trying to untie and you couldn't get it untied all the way, and you start looking like a campground raccoon and you're pawing at it and you're using your teeth? That was how I felt from May 1st through about July 15th, because every day we were getting notifications of new transfers. And between May 1st and July 15th, we exceeded 400 transfers in the Prep Redzone system and in the other ones. And these were kids that we already knew about. That didn't include some high school freshman or sophomore that played JV last year that we had no clue existed. We can only, in any given year, you got 10,000 high school football players in the state of South Carolina. We don't have time to track JV kids. We don't evaluate JV kids. And unless it's just a super special circumstance, maybe we've known about this kid. Maybe he showed up to the Prep Redzone combine as an 8th grader, and, we see a kid who's 6'3", 210. We're probably going to pay attention. But for whatever reason, let's say he doesn't play varsity ball, none of those kids were included in that 400 number. And so every day we were transferring kids over. And it's a meticulous process of, we need to check with the exiting school, we need to check with the entering school, and if possible, we're checking with the kids' parents. Because, listen, we got a lot of bad information too. And we got a lot of kids that were jumping the gun saying, oh, I'm transferring from school XYZ, I'm going to ABC instead. Well, school ABC's never heard a darn thing about it. And we actually had one situation, and I won't name the school because they did nothing wrong and we're not going to drop the hammer on them. But we did have one, that we chased very early on, and it was a fairly high profile, player who said he was going to another school. And he went over to that school, started the enrollment process, actually went and stood along the sideline at a off-season football practice, but never got pads, never got team gear, no nothing. And when we switched him up, we immediately started getting messages up about that kid's not at that school. Well, turned out he kind of went incognito for about a month and a half. Nobody knew where he was. So we were working really about a 15 to 18 school, perimeter around his original school, trying to figure out where he went. Turned out he just didn't want to practice all summer. And he showed back up at his original school. And, again, we chased our tails on that because we wanted to be right. But until the kid practices with the new team or until he's sitting in a classroom, all the talk in the world doesn't matter. So one of the things that we discovered early in the process was the high school league was not tracking any of those transfers prior to July 1st. And the reason why was because, honestly, they wiped their hands of it a little bit. They said, we will figure it out starting with the new academic year. And then they've got until the July 30th date or 29th date, whatever it was, before it's official. So we did have kids that were bouncing around school to school to school, and I don't want to make it sound like this is a blue chip situation where mom and dad are shopping kids necessarily, but a lot of people were really exploring their options there. And what it left with was a summer of craziness, a summer of doubt, trying to figure out where kids are going to go. And the thing that I said all along, and I was very open about this on Twitter, was until we got some horror stories out of the transfers, kids it was going to get worse and worse. Yeah. Because everybody thinks that the grass is always greener. Everybody always thinks, oh, this is, and look, man, I've been on your show before. We've talked about transfers. We've talked about kids coming and going from traditional publics to charters to privates and all that stuff. This isn't, no one's immune. No football coach in the state is immune. And I think that's why we saw some of the reaction that we did when a couple of players decided that they were going to try to transfer mid-season. It's because I don't know in the last 4, 5, 6 years that we've had anything that was maybe as universally accepted to be the case as much as we don't want mid-season transfers. We don't want to open that door where some powerhouse 5A school whose quarterback tears his ACL is all of a sudden getting a run of pretty good Class 3A or even other 5A quarterbacks who just say, you know what, I got like 2 months of high school football left. I'd rather go win a title and sit out my 22 days. When everything happened with, a few higher profile players, I spent 2 days on this, and the only consensus out of the whole thing was, God, I hope this doesn't happen, because nobody wants to be dealing with that. Yeah. Coaches who have kids get hurt don't want to have to worry about putting the locker room back together with new blood. Okay. But at the same time, coaches don't want to be looking over their shoulder, feeling like they got to recruit their own players throughout the duration of the season. More often than not, when a kid transfers out from a high school in the off season, the high school coach of the departed school will say, you know what, I hope that kid finds his way and I hope something good happens for him, but we're probably going to be better off. Okay. Kids very rarely transfer when everything's going right. They transfer for playing time. They transfer because they don't like their coach. Maybe they don't like their teammates. Okay. But when things are going swimmingly, they're rarely transferring. Coaches don't want to open that door where they got to start wondering, oh man, am I going to have to find a new running back in the next 2 weeks? Because everybody's got their own hopes and dreams about what they want every football season to be. Some of them are more realistic than others, yes. But as far as the transfer stuff, it's chaotic, and it's going to be chaotic for a while. And I think that's partly by design, to show people that, like, you guys asked for this for so long, and you begged for this, and you said that the charters were and the privates were able to get away with things that the traditionals weren't. So we're just going to let everybody have this. We're going to wipe the canvas clean, everybody do what you want to do. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Nothing's 100% foolproof, and the transfer market has proved that, because we got a lot of disappointed kids right now wondering what they gave up for the greener grass somewhere else.
Ian, we talked about some off-field State of Union stuff. Let's kind of get into some maybe the play on the field this year and what you're seeing and what you're thinking so far. But let's look down at the 1A ranks. A class that was dominated by Abbeville last year. They look to be really good again this year. But Drill and I have had a lot of fun following the lower state 1A teams this year. Carvers Bay, for instance, has had an awesome year. We had a chance to talk to Coach Richard a couple weeks ago. What he has done has been great. What are you seeing in that class? It feels like upper state is probably Abbeville's to lose, but lower state seems wide open to us right now.
Yeah, I think it's, you start talking about Carvers Bay, Bamberg, Earhart, Cross. I mean, we've got some good ones. I'm not sure exactly when this is airing, but I'm going to Carvers Bay on Friday night.
Big matchup with Johnsonville, yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing it. And, not a lot of people are talking about Johnsonville either. And I get it. I mean, 6-1, and they've got kind of a quirky loss on their schedule. But, that's another really good team that, we saw 2 of the last 3 years playing for a state championship. So, I think there's a lot of talent there. And I think, what we're seeing from those lower classifications is I'm not saying better coaching, because it's a lot of the same faces, right? But I think that they're finding their talented pieces to put them in the right places early. Last year, Kennard Hayward, who's got 1,700 rushing yards and I think 18 or 19 touchdowns already for Carvers Bay. I mean, insane total, right? Very few people know about that kid. I think also part of that is by design. I think that, Matt's been trying to keep him under the radar a little bit and try to, make sure that not everybody can scout him out. Granted, when you're averaging 230 rushing yards a game, scout away in my mind. I don't want to try to tackle the kid, and, oh, by the way, I got to get by Zion Giles to do it. Oh, that sounds like fun. Okay, good job. But look at Cross. Cross is a great example. Cross has one of the absolute best two-way players in the state, and he would be starting for any school in the state, Dutch Fork included, and you got everybody at Bamberg. I mean, they lose, Corey's son, Chanston, goes off to college, and everybody's kind of wondering, well, they got another quarterback who's throwing for about 260 a game. They still got Marcus Can, who's been one of the most electric athletes in the state for the last 2 years. They've got a lot of name recognition, but it's more about being comfortable with each other. Carvers Bay is maybe the surprise of that bunch, just simply because they didn't have that type of running game last year. All most people knew about Carvers Bay last year was Zion. Now it's, oh boy, they're winning, and they're putting some pain on people too. So I'm really looking forward to, seeing them on Friday. I've seen Bamberg and Cross the last couple postseasons. They're a fun watch, man. It's fun football. It's wide open. It's get the ball in your athletes' hands and see if anybody can stop them. And it's led to some, really fun results. I think the 1A lower state playoffs are going to be really fun because of it.
Yeah, true. I'm glad we're finally talking football. Where Shoals, that's another one too there in 1A, man. I'm excited to see their matchup in a couple weeks there with Abbeville. It'd be a good barometer for both of those programs. Let's jump up to 2A. Let's keep it rolling. Really excited about this one. But I think Clinton, they have just really asserted themselves as they have, if they just play that brutal murderers row non-region, they really have asserted themselves. So I think Clinton's there. Strom Thurmond looks really good this year. And then that region, I think it's region 4, that split region there with Andrew Jackson just coming out of nowhere, knocking off Central and Cheraw here. What do you make of 2A right now?
Trying not to swear because it's crazy. Okay.
Yes.
I think that the 3A playoffs are going to be insane. The 2A playoffs aren't going to be much different. Listen, I covered Cheraw early in the year when they went and played Darlington. Mm-hmm. And the roster is small. I think it was maybe 28, 29 deep. The sheer size that Cheraw had, their kicker made me look small. And I'm 6 foot, 200 pounds. And the kicker is making me look small. And I'm like, what other positions he's play? Nothing. He just kicks. Like, of course he does. They got a 6'6" defensive tackle at Sherrall, and Central, beat them pretty good, and I think when you start introducing all that talent and you've got those teams that have kind of got some fluidity from last year. I mean, all the tragedy that, that Central was trying to pick up the pieces from, and they've just bounced back and playing, for Sean and everything else. It's this great story. And I don't think them losing to AJ is the end of the road by any means.
No,
I just think that means that somebody's going to get a really, really good number 2 seed in the playoffs that they ain't going to be ready for. You start projecting out some of the playoff brackets as the way they stand now going into the last 2 weeks of the regular season. And there's obviously a bunch of different possibilities, but we can start pinpointing when, one team's going to play another, and just go ahead and start circling the calendar. It's just a matter of where that game's going to be, depending on how those 2 teams finish, their own region slate, and it goes well beyond the number 1 seeds. Sherrall, I'm going to go back to them. They're another good example. There's going to be some team that doesn't recognize how big and strong and fast they are. And let's not forget that they played a good chunk of the year without one of their best offensive players. That kid's back. And if they put the pieces back together in a hurry, then watch out for them. And they might be a 3 or 4 seed in the playoffs. I mean, what are we doing? I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be exciting. It's not supposed to just be chalk all the way through. Chalk is boring to me. I don't want to see that. I want to see some upsets, in seeding, knowing full well that it may not actually be a realistic upset. It's just because Team A finished better than Team B in their respective region.
And 2A for us too, Ian, it feels like, the upper state, the big players, Clinton's going to be there, Thurman's going to be there. I think a Batesburg-Leesville team, a Chester team are all really dangerous, but it feels like it's kind of hard almost to see in the lower state who are the real contenders. I think Hampton County is really good. And you mentioned Region 4. I think that 2 and 3 going down there those are going to be 2 teams to look out for. But is there another team that we're maybe missing? Is there a Timberland, a Philip Simmons? Is there a third or fourth team that can really make noise down there?
Philip Simmons is they're rolling at the right time, man. They've put it all together, and obviously they gotta be able to beat Timberland, but whoever comes out of that game is sitting real pretty, because what they're going to do is they're going to push off that game against Hampton County. Guys, Hampton County's got legit speed. They had a kid last week in a game run 22.3 miles an hour. Okay. You guys know who I used to work for. Most people around the state do. We didn't have a 22-mile-an-hour guy on any kid that I put in a vest last year.
That's moving.
And he did it on a 35-yard jet sweep. So he got up to that speed very, very quickly. And this is a kid who doesn't play a ton of offense. He's mainly a defensive back. He's a safety. As long as they got Jalen Singletary at Hampton County too, they're dangerous. He's ridiculous. I mean, he's got, seems like, just about every week he's got a 50, 60, 70-yard touchdown run. You get him on the edge, yeah, good luck, But you start looking at Hampton County, you look at Philip Simmons, you look at Timberland. Timberland's much better than they were last year. Woodland could be a sneaky team. They've had some quirky losses, but Woodland's got talent. If Andrews were to get hot, Andrews has got one of the best defensive ends in the state in Chris Stewart. And all it takes is him coming in hot on one edge blitz, and it might be ball game. He's got that kind of power. He could change a game in one play. So there are a lot of teams in 2A that, again, maybe we're not pinpointing them because they're not going to win their region, but that doesn't mean to discount them. And that's what, again, going back to what I said before, that's what makes the playoffs fun.
I can't wait for 2A playoffs, but unabashedly, my favorite classification is 3A. I thought it got gutted a couple years ago. I was really scared with that reclass, but looking at this playoff picture, and we've been following it all year, obviously Oceanside makes the big splash, knocking off Dutch Fork. I think there's a big gap between everybody else, but once you get to 2 through, I don't know, maybe 12 deep, I don't think there's much in between the rest of those teams. Do you think differently? I think there may be a second tier in there. But what are your thoughts so far when it comes to 3A and how that's shaping up as well?
Yeah, I'm thinking it was 3 or 4 weeks ago when I sent in my poll votes, and I was traveling and getting ready to start a vacation, so I did it like super late on like a Friday night. And I remember sending the email to, Lou and Jed and Travis, and 3A playoffs are going to be insane, guys. Like,
Yeah.
And that thought hasn't left my head because, I've seen Loris, I've seen Dylan, and we're sending our new reporter to, Rickson Lane is going over to Loris this week to watch them in Marlboro County. I mean, Marlboro County is a team that very few people are talking about. They're most likely going to be a 3 seed, in the playoffs. You going to tell me that Marlboro County is going to be, what would that make them? That'd make them the 7th through 9th best team, in the lower state field. I mean, that's just kind of insane to think about, that there's that much talent squeezed into 3A. And I think what you were talking about when we were all kind of worried, did 3A get gutted? Yes, it did in terms of teams, but what I also think it did was kind of compact everybody together. Oceanside has got to be, Oceanside's got to be considered the team until they're not.
Yeah.
As long as Aiden Monavian is putting on Oceanside Landshark gear, I'm probably not betting against them, And if you were to ask me right now, I would tell you that, based on what I'm looking at the brackets, I got a hard time seeing Oceanside and Loris not playing in the lower state final again. But, what happens when you assume? You really don't think that Dylan could shock some people? Would it even be that much of a shock? Dylan's got a freshman quarterback who's going to end up throwing for about 2,700 yards this year. They got Zamarius Robertson outside playing, wide receiver, who's barely been asked to play DB at all. Let's not forget the fact that North Carolina is recruiting him as a defensive back, and he's previously had 4 or 5 interceptions in a season. What happens when push comes to shove and all of a sudden it's not 85 degrees and you need some of those offensive linemen to fill some gaps on defensive line too? Now it starts to look like the Dylan programs of old, even if they don't have that 2,000-yard rusher that we've gotten used to seeing them have every year. I think their top rusher right now is sitting at 600 to 700 yards. I mean, that's pretty uncharacteristic for them. But at the end of the day, Dylan football was built on one thing, and Kelvin Roller was there when it was being built. He knows what's gonna breed success. So you start factoring, teams like that into the lower state as well. Who the heck knows?
And you get Newberry going in there as well, who's been a big story this year. But I do want to ask, Upper State in 3A, because that's one that we've kind of struggled with. BHP, last year's Upper State champ, has just been boat racing everybody, but I feel like they haven't played anybody. So I can't get a good feel for how good they are. Are they above Woodruff? Does Powdersville or does Mountain View Prep sneak in there? Obviously, Woodruff had the big win last week over them, but is BHP still the favorite in Upper State? What do you know about that squad, or who do you like in that part of the state?
Yeah, I like BHP a lot. You've got a quarterback who's now in his 3rd year of starting. You've got a running back who was, Henderson's backup. And I mean, what did MJ Earl run for last year as the backup? I mean, he looked like, your traditional fantasy monster where he didn't get a ton of carries, but it felt like he was always in the end zone when he did, And so, obviously, Woodruff is riding high right now after beating MVP, but MVP is kind of, outside of Katie Hainsworth. I mean, they were in a lot of ways a rebuilt team. And this is a team who found out that its running back was graduating a year early in the middle of spring ball. So, it's kind of a goofy thing, but, if MVP is not one of the top 5 or 6 teams in the Upper State, then show me some that are better, but also sign me up for a season pass to the 3A playoffs, because I mean, that's fun. Woodruff is a fantastic team. I've thought the world of Cam Taylor. They lose a 2-year starter, senior quarterback, and they plug the next guy in, and he looks even better and he looks stronger. They've obviously got a running back that maybe a few of your listeners have heard about. He's pretty good too. I think that, in the Upper State, and the thing that I forgot earlier, just my mind blanked, but I was thinking Newberry was up there. So obviously, you throw Newberry, Swansea, Silver Bluff into those lower state playoffs as well. And it's again, you can do that on both, upper and lower state for just about every classification. We're like, okay, who are the 2 or 3 teams that we want to pinpoint that are not going to go into the playoffs as region champs? And I'm telling you that those 2 or 3 teams are going to make some noise, and people are going to be like, boy, that was fun.
Yeah, we go through that entire segment and we don't mention undefeated Orangeburg Wilkinson as well. So, that's the crazy thing about 3A football right now. Let's jump up to 4A too, though, man. That's also going to be a lot of fun in this playoffs. I think there are some teams that really are a little bit different than normal. But the one that I have the biggest question about is AC Flora. We get questions about it. We don't really know much about them. What are your thoughts on AC Flora? Are they a legitimate top 5 team right now in 4A, or is it kind of just a product of their record right now?
Well, I mean, they're not playing a lot of slouches. So if it's a product of their record, I'm sure they would be fine with that. Roper Wensky's the number 1 quarterback in the Prep Redzone class of 2026 for a reason. And it's not simply because he's got guys to throw to. I mean, he does, and he's got
a couple guys out there,
and he's got some really good guys blocking for him. And there's some defensive pieces on that team that may or may not have just gotten offers from Wisconsin in the last 24 hours. But I mean, if they're pretenders, then show me the contenders in 4A, because just because they haven't been there since 2020 doesn't mean that they couldn't make another run. There's no reason to believe that that AC Flora couldn't be, in the state championship game. They're a good team. They played up a decent amount when they needed to. They lose to South Point, and people kind of, South Point's freaking loaded. I mean, there's no shame in losing by a few points to South Point. I mean, if that's our barometer, then good golly, what are we doing? So I like AC Flora a lot. And I think they're going to be one of those teams that, I think a lot of opponents are going to be hoping that it's pouring down rain when they have to play them in the playoffs.
You mentioned South Point, Ian. I had a chance to watch them against Northwestern, and they have talent athletes everywhere. And with them going, upper state in 4A, who is their biggest competition? Is it a Daniel squad? Is it somebody like Camden who they've already beat? Are we missing somebody? Is Westside getting hot at the right time? I mean, upper state playoffs seems to be heavily favored for the Stallions, in my opinion, right now.
They've been my number 1 team in the class since March. Yeah. And, again, it's maybe not as pronounced as my feelings about Oceanside and 3A, simply because they weren't there last year, and it's not like a continuation of everything that they've been building. It was, there are a lot of homegrown guys. There's also been a big influx of transfers. There's also, you got guys like Rayshawn Brown, who's a freshman tailback. It's like, I mean, if he didn't have competition for the job, everybody and their mother would be talking about this kid, because he'd probably be at 2,000 yards already. So, I'm having a hard time seeing anybody in upper state, knock off South Point. But also, I think it's really important that we can't discount what Daniel's been able to do, and I'm not saying that they're not culpable for all the stuff that's happened in the last calendar year, but to bounce back from that and put a product on the field that has looked the way it has, with a kid playing quarterback who's playing for a different school last year after previously being at Daniel, after getting a bunch of younger guys who have all got all this kind of college attention. You got offers galore going to that sophomore class. You lose a quarterback who honestly might be the number 1 quarterback in the class of 2029 nationally, who went to Rabun Gap. But the last 4 or 5 weeks, there's not a team in the state that is putting up scores like Daniel has, for the most part. And so you start looking at that, and I think you use the term getting hot at the right time. I think Daniel is that team getting hot at the right time. Is it going to be enough against South Point? I don't know, because South Point's got athletes that a lot of 5A teams would be like, hey, can we get some of that when you're bored with it? I mean, that's just, they're loaded. They've got, the quarterback situation is finally, it seems like it's steadied and nobody's just talking about that anymore. And it's not like they plugged in some scrub to play quarterback. I mean, the kid's committed to Carolina, and there's been some other South Carolina defensive backs over the years who used to play quarterback for South Point as well. So, in the upper state, I'm sticking with South Point until somebody proves me otherwise.
Got to ask you about another team before we go up to 5A in the 4A classification. That's Hilton Head Island. You're a little bit closer to that region. We don't obviously get down there very frequently, and that's one of my favorite regions. I love Region 6 and 4A. I love those programs. We really kind of pinpointed Bishop England after they came out of nowhere last year to kind of be in control, but it's been Hilton Head, and they've played such good football this season. What do you make of this program right now and how they're playing?
The best way I can describe Hilton Head to people who are just looking at schedules or results or stats or anything like that is Hilton Head has always had one or two guys, just absolute studs. We see one playing on Saturdays and we see one playing on Sundays just about every week. Okay. So they've always had those guys, because there's always going to be, some super athletic kid whose parents just love living on Hilton Head Island. It's kind of beautiful there. I can see the appeal if you like that sort of thing. I mean, it's no Myrtle Beach, but you take what you can get. Okay.
It's fine. It's fine.
What they have though, the last 2 years and what they've been building is they got a bunch of really, really good football players. Are they 4 and 5 star guys? Absolutely not. You look at Thaddeus Zarnecki. He's a starting running back. He's probably going to end up somewhere in the neighborhood of that 18 to 2,100 yards, depending on what they do in the playoffs. He's also going to probably end up in the 70 to 90 tackle range because he's also a starting linebacker. They got Andrew Massey, who is just creating turnovers left and right. He's picked off passes. He's blocked punts. He's blocked kicks. Forces fumbles and also gets a lot of tackles. You've got a 6'4" quarterback and Derek Ranizowski. I'm hoping I didn't butcher his name as bad as it just came out of my mouth, but I probably did. They've got all these pieces. They've got some big offensive linemen, Andrew Crockett. They've got these guys, and honestly, they're bullying their way through that region. The big test, at the beginning of the year, what I would have thought for them would have been the Bishop England game. After about 5 or 6 games, my big test for them was how are they going to handle May River? May River runs that wing T that is different than everybody else. It doesn't look like, as BJ Payne told me a couple weeks ago, it doesn't look like what we knew Hartsville's old wing T to go, what it looked like before they kind of amended it, 2 years ago. It's completely different. So in back-to-back weeks, and I'm sorry, 2 out of 3 weeks, they took care of May River. They took care of Bishop England. And those were their 2 biggest competition points. And they did it without, I'm not going to say without breaking a sweat, but they made it look a lot easier than even I would have imagined. And BJ Payne and I talk about once a week. So for me to be kind of surprised by that result, that told me that, okay, I think the Seahawks are finally ready to do something here.
Let's look at 5A Division II, Ian. And going into the season, we do our season preview show. We're like, hey, we wouldn't be surprised if we saw a rematch, Irmo Northwestern from last year. And it looks like we could be heading that way. But the story to me, and you mentioned them earlier, Indian Land, what Coach Hastings' bunch has done, undefeated right now. They play the Trojans next week. We'll find out a lot about that group. But are they a team that, is a real threat to challenge for the title? Is it more of a, hey, we haven't played our biggest conference game yet, so we're kind of still undefeated? Or what do you make of that group there for Coach Hastings?
I am convinced that Adam Hastings is doing his best to never talk to anybody because I think that he is so high on his kids right now. He doesn't want anything to screw it up. That's my opinion. That's not, anything like, and anything deep that I'm giving your viewers here. That team was pretty good last year. And they were 6-6. If they weren't the best 6-6 team in the state last year, I'd be surprised. Sequel Patterson has, obviously he's given up a year of high school, but he's got a head of steam going. You got the Connors, you got Jamal Horton at tailback. You got all of these kids that have all grown up together. They're all buddies from, darn near diaper age. And, you've got all of them, the boat is all going, they're all rowing that boat in the same direction. And I think, at the end of the day, that game next week against Northwestern is going to be very, very telling. I don't think it's going to be necessarily be an end all be all. And I think that most people would probably agree with me that Northwestern has to be considered the favorite. But, the one thing that we haven't seen, and this will be the wild card for Indian Land, is if they do not win that game, how do they respond to it? Because we haven't been asked. They haven't been asked, how are you going to respond to a loss? How are you going to respond to playing one of the quote unquote best teams in the state that's gonna be shining all those rings all around the stadium when you play them and everything else? How are you going to respond if things don't go your way? And then if you go down to a microcosm of that, how are you going to respond if the first quarter doesn't go your way? If Cam Vance catches a little inside slant and the next thing you know, he's 77 yards to the house, how is Indian Land going to respond to that for the second quarter? I think that'll be really interesting. And I think that we're going to learn more about Indian Land in week 10 than we have in the first 9 weeks of the season, just simply because we don't know.
Before we move on, I got to talk about Irmo. And I don't think, they just reloaded. And I did not expect them to be this good. I mean, obviously, Coach Brand is one of the best out there. And, they just lost so much with AJ leaving, Donovan leaving. And they have not really, they had little growing pains, I would say. We saw them play Burns earlier in the year, but really haven't skipped a beat. What do you make of that Irmo program and their performance this year?
No, I think that you better believe that system matters, because while some of the pieces changed place, let's not act like Drayvon Dobson isn't one of the baddest dudes in the state. I don't know how many people know this about him, but he played all of his junior season, after a pretty significant surgery over the summer. And if it was my kid, he wouldn't have been playing football last year. The fact that he went out there and did what he did his junior year after everything he went through tells me that's one of the guttiest kids in the state. Okay. And I've talked with him about it. I've talked with his dad about it. And, the kid is good. At the same time, until he got that starting job, we weren't sure if he was going to click fast enough. Irmo's got another quarterback coming up right behind him that they've been grooming for 18 months. And that kid's special too. So even after whatever happens this year comes to an end, Irmo's going to be back next year too. Will it be as dominant? Probably not, at least at the start of the year. But let's not act like all the talent's graduating again. I mean, Major Taylor, he announces he's going to Yale, and there were a lot of people that had no idea who Major was because of all the other big names in the trenches for Irmo. And look, I live in Horry County. I mentioned that before. The biggest issue with high school football for the 9-10 Horry County programs is that there's a lack of size and there's a lack of real skill in the trenches. And it's made a huge difference. You've seen that with the results of what a lot of the Horry County football programs have done over the last 2 years, after what was just a near dominant stretch where it felt like every year you were throwing a dart to see which team was going to make a run in the playoffs. Okay. Irmo's got that. Irmo's got that size. They've got that development. They've got an offensive and defensive line staff that are very fluid year after year after year. And they're training these guys. They're getting better. They're getting bigger. They're getting faster. They're getting an occasional transfer. Tyrone Jennings, I mean, obviously that was a very heated week for him last week playing against White Knoll. I mean, that kid was already a special talent. He was, top 15, top 20 player in the class for a reason. And he's going into a team that's already got a whole bunch of those guys already. I don't think that anybody that's really paying attention would have expected a massive drop-off. At the same time, I don't think it's unrealistic to say, okay, I didn't quite think they were going to be that good either.
5A Division I, Ian. So we get to Dutch Fork, who has been the favorite for however many years in a row now. But this year it feels like they might not have their best group. Just some of the early season stuff was a little bit odd, and some of their showings have maybe not been as impressive as some of the other groups we've seen from Coach Knotts. But we still got the number one, as obviously most folks do. But last week with Somerville losing, that really kind of threw 5A Division I and kind of into a loop. Because now I don't know what to make of it. Like, I thought Somerville was a clear 2, but then they lose. You got Stratford, James Allen right behind them. You got Ridgeview, who has looked great. Who do you like besides Dutch Fork there at the top? I mean, who do you think are maybe the top 2 or 3 best teams in Division One?
I love how we're discounting Dutch Fork because they lost a September game, and
Right.
they're 6-1, and they're 4th in the high school league RPI, and they're 5th in the Prep Redzone power scores. And man, they're just not beating people by enough. I mean, we have been so jaded watching Dutch Fork for the last 12 years. It's like we don't even know what to do with ourselves because, oh my gosh, they lost to a game to a team that's won back-to-back state titles. How dare them?
Yeah.
Look, man, it's I'm I got a lot of respect for what Tom Knotts is able to get his guys to do when the lights are really on. And, Mark Morris at Carolina Forest has taught me a lot about this. And that what happens the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season, realistically, it doesn't mean a whole lot, even when you're implementing RPI systems and everything else, because a lot of that will balance out, and, once you get to October, that's when the lights really come on. When you get to November, they get a little brighter. And let's not discount that a lot of teams are going to go into a game against Dutch Fork, and they're going to know that they're playing Dutch Fork. It's hard. I watched Boiling Springs last year in the 3rd round go to Dutch Fork, and Matt Reel purposely got his bus there late so that they weren't part of the pregame antics of Dutch Fork players amping themselves up. I mean, we've all seen it. They run down the hill, they go to the 50, and it doesn't even matter if anybody else is on the field or not. But Matt didn't want his guys to be blown away by that. It didn't matter. I mean, a few minutes into the game, it was clear that Dutch Fork was just, turning into, they're going to turn into one of the best running teams ever. It was like, where the heck did this come from? So that's tough. If you're looking at a type of team that can dislodge that kind of break that rhythm, you're going to need to have athletes, but you're going to need to be super disciplined. And right now, the team that I think that might, because I think there's a couple of them, but if I have to elevate one to the top of the list, the team that I could see competing with somebody like that is James Island. You're talking about one of the most buckled up defenses in the state. You're talking about a quarterback in Connor Dantzler who's throwing for about 285 a game. He's very productive, doesn't make a lot of mistakes. They've got a tailback who's big and strong and doesn't fumble. Okay. You don't necessarily have to blow the doors off Dutch Fork. You don't need to score every possession. You need to win a field position game. And I think that James Island is very, very well equipped to do something like that. The only caveat to the whole thing is does James Island have enough of those guys that can handle the moment, 2nd, 3rd, 4th round under those lights as they get a little brighter, as you're playing these other big name programs. Let's not forget that James Island, they are Division I, but a lot of that is because of that multiplier. They've got a lot of kids on the island who never set foot in James Island that are counting against their number. They are, in all reality, they're a Division II team, if not a 4A team, but they're playing up to Division I. But like I said, guys, I've seen these guys live this year. They are very, very buttoned up, and it's going to take something like that. Somerville, let's not forget that this is one of the most talented rosters in the state. They're not done, guys. Somerville's not done. Ashley Ridge has been kind of enigmatic, but the last 3 weeks they've looked like world beaters. Ask Somerville about that. They'll be glad to tell you. They're not very happy about it. There's a couple others in there too. Carolina Forest is one. They're really hard for me to break down because the rest of their region is really lacking. They're playing Myrtle Beach this week, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was another blowout game because Carolina Forest finds somebody's weakness and they lean on it better than probably anybody I've ever seen in my 20-something years in this state. They do a very good job, and let's not forget that they got a running back that averages 190 a game and a quarterback who's seemingly come out of nowhere, and he's already up over 1,200 yards passing. It's been a while since Carolina Forest has had a quarterback and the speed at receiver that they've got right now. They could be dangerous too, and they have no problem getting into a 50-40 game. I think they've already had a couple of them this year. So, there are some teams that they could rise up once or twice, but if you're talking about who might unseat Dutch Fork, if you're just looking at rosters right now, I'd say probably James Island.
I love that pick because we've really tried to highlight lower state, teams, especially because I don't feel like they're getting the love that they deserve in the polls across the state. But one program in particular, Stratford, we've had them ranked highly all year. Is there something that we're missing with this bunch that other people are not seeing with them?
I think it's the newness. I think it's hard to trust a team that hasn't had a lot of recent success in the playoffs. I think it's hard to say, well, sure, you might have got one of the top running backs in the state to come over in July, but is that good enough? I mean, come on. Malik McGowan is a special talent. Let's not act like Davis isn't, pretty special at quarterback. Let's not act like Kermit Davis isn't one of the top few, handfuls of sophomores in the state at defensive end. They've got a couple of linebackers that are juniors that, very few people have talked about. I wrote about them this week. They're good. They're just unproven. And it's hard to say that, a narrow loss to Somerville in August is going to transpire for the rest of the year. There's been so many ups and downs out of those Charleston big class 5A teams that it's kind of hard to put, a real finger on them because you're not sure what are we actually seeing versus what we think we're seeing. I think Stratford could be right there. Are they the type of team that should be considered one of the top one or two contenders? I don't think they're there yet, but again, that's what makes the playoffs more interesting is, the years where it's just, okay, well, we're going to play until we play Dutch Fork and then deuces until next year. That's not a lot of fun for everybody else. I mean, I'm sure Dutch Fork loves it, of course, but, some of those upsets that we waited for in the big class playoffs before had nothing to do with Dutch Fork. It was, okay, who's going to upset who to get to Dutch Fork? So, I do think it's more wide open, but at the same time, let's not write off the Silver Foxes just yet.
I did want to ask you about the status. You mentioned throughout the interview that you live in Horry County, so obviously that's a little bit special to you, and you got a microscope there. I want to ask you about who do you think is the best program there right now? Kevin has been banging the Loris drum for years. He has been probably the biggest Loris supporter and vocalist across the state. Who do you think is the best program right now in Horry County?
If they were to play each other in terms of who's going to last longer in the playoffs, because those are two very different questions. I think
answer any way you want to.
It's the top two are easily Loris and Carolina Forest. If they play each other, I'm probably tipping toward Carolina Forest just simply because, again, Carolina Forest is an absolute master on exposing weaknesses and then leaning on them and then getting you to break as a team. Since Mark was hired in 2014, I've seen him do it to some very good teams. I've seen, a lot of people forget one of the years that Fort Dorchester was coming through and they couldn't be stopped. Steve LaPrade brought his team up there and benched it. His quarterback was a little dinged up and he benched him and put in a replacement. And Mark noticed that so early and he frustrated Steve so much that Steve brought the kid off the bench and Fort D ended up winning the game and they ended up going on and compete for a state title and all that. But that was one of the very earliest years in Carolina Forest. And so I just think that they're one of those teams that you've got to watch in terms of pure talent and respective to their classification. It's head and shoulders Loris, I think that any other team in the area, I think if you put up against Loris, I think Loris beats them. And I'm talking about Myrtle Beach. I'm talking about North Myrtle, St. James, Soxty, Conway, Aner, Green Sea, Atlantic Collegiate. You want to dip down into Georgetown. I mean, they've made a mess of games with, Georgetown and Waccamaw already. And it's that team is very, very special. And one of the things about Moon Gerald is he's not getting talked about on a statewide level because his passing yards aren't up. Well, the reason his passing yards aren't up is because they're running clocking everybody, and he's coming out of the game, and they're going heavy set packages or throwing in the backup or whatever it is. What you need to look at about Moon is that over the last two seasons, and you're talking about if you factor in his 13 games from last year, and he's played 8 this year. So what, 21 games, 22 games, I think maybe. The kid's thrown 2 interceptions. How unreal is that? That a 3A quarterback playing the type of teams that they are, like Dillon, they played Oceanside. I don't think he threw I think he threw 1 pick against Oceanside. The kid's got a great head on him. He knows that if his first read isn't there, he's going to look at his second. If it's not, he can move a little bit. He doesn't run as much as he can. He's a very athletic kid. And I think part of that's by design. I think they want to make sure he's not taking extra hits. But he's got targets. He's got a great offensive and defensive line. Jamarius Wilson is, one of the best two-way linemen in the state, and nobody even knows who the heck he is. Fantastic center, defensive end tackle combo. Demarie Thurman is just a man-child. And I say that, he's close to 18 years old, but he's just, he's ferocious. They've got sophomore leading the team in tackles. They got a freshman, Jay Todd is the sophomore. They got a freshman in Ethan Shaw, who's second on the team in tackles. So they're clearly rebuilding. Are they going to take a huge hit next year? Oh, you betcha. But they're not dropping off the table completely. They're not gonna be one of these teams you haven't heard about anymore, just because Moon and Jacoby and Lewis and Demarie Thurman and some of those other guys are gonna be graduating. But that team is special, and I do believe that they're gonna be playing Oceanside in the lower state championship. I do believe that Oceanside is the favorite as of right now. But in 5-6 weeks, if those teams meet, I'll be there. I'll let you know what happens.
Well, last one for you, Ian, and I know I don't want you to tip your hand too much. I know you guys have a lot of stuff going on. You've got your Player of the Year announcement. I'm sure you'll have the nominees here pretty shortly. But who's a guy that you're so well versed? It might be hard to answer this, but who's a guy that you didn't see having the season that he's having so far that's really stood out to you across the state this year?
Oh man, you're testing me here. Amari Verner at Seneca. I knew he was good. And I knew that team was good, and I'm gonna, I guess, let you peek into the processes that maybe jade me a little bit. Was that I was looking a lot more at their passing game, and I believe it was one of our guys, Scott Keeler, toward the beginning of last year, it was like, you might want to take another peek at this kid, and they've got the freshman and the sophomore wide receiver that are both very, very good and all that, but his production value, it can't be overstated, because Seneca is one of those teams. Again, we didn't even talk about him when we were breaking down playoff contenders. That's one of those things that if you've got a tailback who can do that, and maybe he's doing so in a not so flashy way where teams can't jam the box against him, but even if they do, they're going to figure out another way to beat you or just open up other running lanes for him. I really like what that kid has done. I think it's really impressive, because let's not act like the Bobcats haven't had a lot of, a pretty big spotlight for Seneca, at least relative to them. Let's not act like they're doing this all in the darkness and they're able to come. People have been paying attention, and he's still going out there and doing his thing. And, I think he's filling some of the void from those big name backs that we saw in that neck of the woods last year, and he's doing it very nicely. It's just maybe that Seneca isn't a household name, and I'm guilty of that too. I'll admit that. I don't think Seneca Bobcats when I think of high school football in South Carolina, and I'm sure there's people in Pickens that don't even want to admit that they've ever heard of Seneca. So it's that's a big one. I think Cameron Long, the quarterback at Carolina Forest, is another one. Again, not huge yards, nothing that's going to put him into contention for, any kind of real big postseason awards or anything like that. But man, the way that kid throws a ball, I watched him play last year. I've seen him at the combines. What I saw him do in week 0 against Hartsville, was just wow. I didn't know he had it in him. And now, Carolina Forest is 6-1 and probably going to be region champs and going to the playoffs on a pretty high note. And he's the difference, because Jaron Fox is basically doing what he did last year. Yes, he's running all over people, but now they can't the teams that are better equipped at slowing him down, which going back to what we talked about earlier, that's how James Island beat Carolina Forest. They were a little bit more buckled up, and they said, it's okay if Jaron beats us as long as everybody else doesn't beat us too. He still went for 200 and, a couple tutties in that game, but still, Cameron Long's another really good one too, but nobody's going to say much because he's 1,200 yards passing for a team that runs the ball like they do, and they play a lot of opponents where they don't need those guys in the second half.
Well, Ian, this has been great. Where can folks find more you guys work, not only yours, but the rest of the Prep Red Zone team as well?
Yeah, prepredzone.com/South Carolina. It's real simple to find. Google it if you need it. And like I said earlier, the stats pages, the team pages, the power scores, all of those are not behind the paywall. If you do want a subscription to the site and you want to look into one, use the offer code Guerin40. It's my last name, GUERIN 40. You can use that for any 1 year or 2 year subscription to the site. It'll knock 40% off. If you just want the stats, if you just want the scores, if you just want the power scores, guys, that's all available for free. We want that to be accessible to everybody in the state. We're all, if you're looking at a site like that, we already know you're a high school football fan. If you want the content, if you want the rankings, if you want all the award stuff, you know what, you can subscribe. If you don't want to, it's no hard feelings. We don't rank kids based on anything. None of my guys even have any clue who's got a subscription to the site. We keep that one real close to the vest for a reason. We don't want to be making journalistic decisions based on who isn't or who is subscribing. So, if you're interested, again, it's prepredzone.com/South Carolina.
We appreciate your time, Ian. Hope everybody goes and checks him out at the website. Also, his social pages are great as well. Like I mentioned, follow us on all social media, movingchange.com, podcast on all podcast platforms. Jarrell, anything else for Ian before we let him go today?
Ian, we've taken way too much of your time, especially as we go down the stretch here to end the regular season and go into the playoffs. So we're very appreciative of that. And start talking football and it just happens. So didn't realize it was this long, but definitely we would love to have you join us again. So we'll do that in the future. And I know you mentioned listeners, if they had not heard of this team or this player, whatever, if they listen to Moving the Chains and they're subscribed to Prep Red Zone, they've definitely heard of those people.
I was going to say, I'm willing to sit here for an hour and 17 minutes and change with you guys because you know your stuff, you do your research, and you're not playing favorites to everybody. And that's important because, look, we can talk about the same teams because sometimes the same teams just deserve to be talked about a little bit more, or they're in the storylines, the headlines, whatever it is. But, guys, you research the heck out of it. And, listen, I've been here a long time. Okay, I've seen a lot of reporters come and go. I've seen a lot of podcasts come and go. You guys don't get enough credit for everything that you've done. Okay, this is a situation where every week I'm like, I wonder where they're going this week. They're going on the road. I want to know where they're going because I know that I'm going to have information from that game. And even if I got one of my guys at that game, I know I'm going to get more information. You guys do such a great job. I just want to tell you thank you for everything you do. Thank you for helping to keep people informed. I'd like to say that people think of us doing that same thing, but I'm telling you, I'm more than happy to do this with you guys anytime because the amount of research, the amount of knowledge that you guys have, it's important. The high school football landscape in South Carolina needs more of what y'all are doing. Keep it up, and I appreciate it.
We really appreciate the kind words, man. Appreciate your time as always. Look forward to meeting you, hopefully at a game again soon this postseason. We'll see you down there, I'm sure, at some point. But best of luck, and we'll talk soon, all right?
All right, sounds good, guys. Appreciate it.
Founders Federal Credit Union means banking made for you. The on the go, the pick up and go, and the oh, I want to go. Because at Founders, we give you the financial tools that make every dollar work for you. For the little things to the big things. For your future and your peace of mind. We'll always stay grounded in our roots, but reaching beyond what you'd expect is where we'll always go. Find out what our members already know and enjoy a new way to bank. Relax, you're with Founders.
Get ready for the ultimate South Carolina high school football experience with Moving the Chains. From previews to recaps, we've got you covered. Dive into our expert preview shows, predicting winners and sharing insights. Then join us post-game for the thrilling recaps, exclusive interviews, and highlights you won't find anywhere else. Plus, connect with fellow fans on our Friday night spaces on Twitter/X. No one covers South Carolina high school football like us. Join us at Moving Chains on all social media platforms and visit movingchains.com today.